It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. According to the United Nations, the world is facing its greatest humanitarian crisis since 1945. A record 70 million people will require emergency food aid this year. East Africa, Yemen, Northeast Nigeria are in a grip of a devastating food crisis, and the South Sudanese are suffering from famine already. According to UNICEF, 27 million people lack safe water, increasing the threat of cholera and spreading other waterborne diseases. Joining us today to discuss the causes of famine in these countries is Bill Fletcher, Jr. He's an author and former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and an editorial board member of blackcommentator.com. Bill, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Sharmini. Thank you.
Bill, before we start, let's turn to a clip of Mr. Stephen O'Brien, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, speaking to the UN Security Council about the situation in Yemen, Somalia, Kenya, and South Sudan.
The situation for people in each country is dire, and without a major international response, the situation will get worse. All four countries have one thing in common: conflict. This means that we, you, have the possibility to prevent and end further misery and suffering. The UN and its partners are ready to scale up, but we need the access and the funds to do more. It is all preventable. It is possible to avert this crisis, to avert these famines, to avert these looming human catastrophes.
So, Bill, according to the Undersecretary, the international community has a responsibility and obligation to protect the population of these countries from starvation. We also know that famine is rooted not only in drought, but when farmers lose their means of production and livelihood. People must sell their land and then their cattle and then everything they have, and culminate in places where the crisis is actually worse. So give us a sense of what are the conditions that culminate to create famine?
Well, you know, the thing is, Sharmini, it's important when we look at these so-called humanitarian crises that we understand that at base, most of them are political, economic, and environmental crises. And so the difficulty when you look at these through the prism of the mainstream media is that you would just think that these are, I don't know, natural disasters of some sort, that there's nothing you can do about them, that they just happen. But what's interesting is when you mention the countries, Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, you could add on to that the Darfur region of the northern Sudan. What you see in each case are political crises. In many cases, war. Somalia has not, for example, had a very functioning United Nations state since 1991. The South Sudan, almost immediately upon separating from the northern Sudan, found itself immersed in this horrendous civil war. The Darfur region, of course, has been fighting against the Khartoum government in the Sudan. So, in other words, the conditions for addressing any of these crises, anything that might be perceived as natural, like a drought, is undermined by the instability of the region. You're not going to be able to address most of these crises without some level of political stability. Look at Yemen. I mean, Yemen will not resolve its situation as long as there's a continued war, as long as the Saudis continue to bomb. And that's the fundamental thing. So when we're looking at resolving these crises, we've got to look at political solutions first. The other piece, though, is environmental. And if you look at the Darfur crisis, or if you look even at the Syrian civil war, one of the major contributing factors has been the shift in the environment and the impact that has had on forcing populations to move and aggravating already horrendous conditions.
Now, Bill, of course, we don't want to blame everything on the U.S., but one cannot ignore the fact that U.S.-backed Kenyan invasion of Somalia, as well as the drone and proxy wars in Somalia, and creating famine on the ground is, as you said, politically driven or politically caused at times. Give us a better understanding of these kinds of political situations that you're talking about by giving us some examples.
Well, let's look at Somalia, because it's a very tragic case. Somalia was a unified nation, the Somali Republic. In 1991, there was an insurrection against the historically backed by the U.S. dictatorship of Siad Barre. And when Siad Barre was overthrown, and essentially the United States abandoned Siad Barre, instead of a unified government taking over, you had the descent into warlordism that most of the world, including the United States, frankly could care very little about. What was of most concern to the West was access to resources in Somalia, and they were more than comfortable working through the existence of warlords. When you have a situation like that, which existed beginning in 91, and then that was followed by the introduction for a while of something called the Union of Islamic Courts that was then overthrown by the Ethiopians, this gross instability made it impossible for the resurrection of a real Somali state. So the United States has a particular obligation here. One is that it propped up a dictatorship, the Siad Barre regime. Second, it abandoned Somalia when it no longer needed it for strategic reasons. And then third, when it decided to re-intervene, particularly through the use of Ethiopian troops in 2004, it further destabilized the situation. So the United States is complicit in the situation, but I wouldn't say that the situation there is solely to be blamed on the United States. But we certainly have a nickel in that dime.
Right. And let's turn to South Sudan. The newer state to come into existence has been ravaged by 3 years of a brutal civil war. Oxfam states that more than 3 million people have been forced to flee into neighboring countries. What role are international actors playing in worsening the situation in South Sudan? And conversely, what can be done to improve the situation there?
I'm not sure I have a good answer in terms of what best to be done. But I think it's important to understand that the South Sudan was the site of a long-standing revolution against the Northern Sudanese government based in Khartoum. The Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, which for many years was led by John Garang, the late John Garang, did not intend on leading a secessionist movement. The objective was not the separation of the South Sudan. The objective was actually the transformation of the Sudan. They were based in South Sudan, but they were also aligning with other forces. Now, during this movement, this struggle, there were forces from the West that became very interested in the South Sudan for both resource reasons and ideological reasons. There were the interest in oil. The large stocks of oil in the South Sudan led to a great deal of interest on the part of major oil companies. The ideological interest was sort of bizarre. There were these right-wing Christians that decided that the fight in the Sudan was a 20th and then 21st century version of the Crusades, of Christians against Muslims, because the South Sudan is largely Christian and animist. And despite the fact that the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement was not a right-wing movement, there were these outside right-wing Christian forces that got involved in stoking the coals. When Garang was killed in an air accident, and there was a transition in the leadership, There was also a transformation in the movement itself. There was a reluctance on the part of the northern Sudanese government in Khartoum to come to real terms. And finally, when there was a resolution of the crisis, the people of South Sudan decided to split off and form a different country. Initially, Sharmini, there was optimism that the South Sudan was going to be a new and proud addition to the African Union. But a power struggle unfolded in the South Sudan within the ruling elite. And that power struggle then transformed into a civil war, which pitted one faction that called upon certain ethnic groups against another faction that called upon other ethnic groups. And it has been an absolute disaster ever since. There will be no military solution, in my humble opinion, to the South Sudanese crisis. I know that the African Union has been trying desperately to arrive at some sort of settlement. It will only be through some sort of peaceful negotiations that this will be brought to an end. In the meantime, what's happening is, as you mentioned, famine, disease, rape as an instrument of political oppression being carried out by forces on both sides. It is an absolute disaster.
Right. And then Nigeria, I don't mean to do a survey here of all the countries in crisis,
Sorry.
but each of these have particularities that people should know about. Nigeria, Oxfam states that at least 4.4 million people in Nigeria and in the northeast part of the country are in need of urgent food assistance, and this is projected to reach 5.7 million by June this year. What similarities and, of course, differences are there between the situation, say, in North Nigeria and those in Sudan and Kenya and Somalia and countries like Kenya and Nigeria? I mean, these, when we think of them still as lush and green and plentiful, but they are no longer. What has happened?
Well, to borrow from Gil Scott-Heron, it follows a pattern, if you see what I mean. It's like if you look at Nigeria, what you have is a combination of gross corruption, the involvement of Western oil companies in the extraction under abysmal conditions of oil and natural gas, and you have this bizarre fundamentalist movement, the Boko Haram, in the northern part of Nigeria that has been carrying out an insurrection against the central government, has been involved in kidnapping, suicide bombings, various forms of terror that make it very difficult to govern and create some level of stability in the north. Now, one of the peculiar elements of the situation in Nigeria is that there are political forces in Nigeria that have ostensibly mainstream political forces that have been in varying ways backing Boko Haram and seem to have an interest in creating instability in northern Nigeria, either perhaps in order to strengthen the hand of the military or to bring about greater pressure on other elements of the political elite in Nigeria. But in the meantime, it's the people of Nigeria that are suffering. So you have that in the north, and then in the southern parts of Nigeria, particularly in the areas where the oil companies are in operation, you have the extraction of crude oil and natural gas. You have a movement for autonomy. You have an environmental justice movement that has been challenging the corruption of the national government as well as the antics of the multinational oil companies. And this environmental justice movement has been historically met with very vicious repression at the hands of the military and the national government. So once again, the conditions that exist, the so-called natural conditions that may lend themselves to a drought, cannot be handled and addressed sufficiently because of the level of instability that exists in the form of war.
Now, this is a very interesting and difficult situation, because with all these political complexities and with Al-Shabaab and other so-called terrorist factors, it's very difficult to deliver aid to the people that needs it, particularly food supplies, water supplies, and so forth. Are they in such a threat in terms of their life on the line now? How does an institution like the UN deliver services to them?
Well, the thing is, Sharmini, that when we're looking at situations where there's terrorism, and I'm separating that from the South Sudan, which is a different kind of civil war. You have to appreciate from the beginning that the activities of terrorists are both similar to criminal organizations as well as insurrections. And so to the extent that terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram are able to tap into any kinds of legitimate political disenchantment on the part of the people, political or economic, the situation will not be resolved solely by military means. The United States' general approach is to assume, in the face of terrorist activity, that you resolve it through a military option. And time and again, this has proven to be an inappropriate measure. There needs to be a level of political reorganization in those countries where you are actually winning people to believe that the nation state is listening to their demands, listening to their concerns, and is actively attempting to address them. It's in that context that you can win people away from any level of support for the terrorists. And certainly there will be a military side to this. I mean, you're not going to be able to convince most of these political forces through nice language to lay down their arms. But when they are in fact isolated from the population, they're not going to be able to sustain themselves. So if you want to address the issue of famine, drought, etc., then there has to be a level of political organizing. If the national government does not have credibility in the minds of the masses of people, the whole thing goes to nothing. So to go back to Nigeria, to the extent that the population doesn't believe that the national government is paying attention to issues of corruption, is paying attention to legitimate demands in the North. I don't mean feudalistic, sectarian demands, but legitimate demands on the people of the North. The government is not going to be able to defeat Boko Haram. Boko Haram will be the herpes of Nigeria. It will be there indefinitely in the system. So you have to extract that by winning over the population. And I think, unfortunately, whether you're looking at Nigeria or many other countries, there's an assumption that simply through the power of the gun, the situation can be resolved. And it won't, no matter how many drones you have.
All right, Bill, so much more to discuss, but I thank you for now and hope you can join us again to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.